Round 9 in Wijk aan Zee saw the top of the table clash between Levon Aronian and Sergei Karjakin. At the start of the round, Aronian had 6 out of 8, Karjakin just half a point behind with 5.5. Let's take a look at that game. The opening went very well for Aronian. He prepared thoroughly, looked at Karjakin's old games and found a really nice new idea, and after the first time control, Aronian was a sound pawn up. Now he's very good at these technical kind of positions, but there's still a long way to go in this one. So he has this outside passed pawn. That's his advantage in the position. Karjakin played h4, looking for counterplay against White's king, and Aronian, I think, played an excellent practical move here. He exchanged queens, and after the queen exchange, his rook is in the perfect position behind the passed pawn, ready to support it, advancing up the board. So the black rook could become rather passive, blockading that pawn. Now this is a very typical technical position, but there are so many nuances in this kind of endgame. We'll see what happens in a moment. I'll point out the big decisions. So black blockades with the rook, and White's only chance here is to bring the king over, to drive away the rook and force the pawn up the board. So there we go, Aronian starts the journey. And here black has a big decision to make. Should he drift his king over to try and support that rook and blockade the pawn, or should he go for counterplay on this side of the board? So this is very typical. You often have to make big strategic decisions, but you have to back it up with precise calculation. Rook and pawn endings are so difficult. Karjakin decided to go for the king side, counterplay on the king side. But okay, let's just see what happens if he brings his king over. So Aronian tries to drive away the rook. The king supports the rook, and now White's rook is free and would like to, well, check is a threat, or maybe attack these pawns. So after this exchange, the rook goes back, and it's like the game starts afresh. So White has achieved something. He's freed his rook, but there's a very long way to go in this game. You know, maybe he gives a check, forces the king back, and then slowly advances up the board. This is typical. We can just say that White has decent winning chances, but a long way to go. But in the game, Karjakin tried, well, the sharper continuation, aiming for counterplay on the king side by aiming for this pawn. Let's see what happened. Aronian continued with his strategic plan of bringing the king over to attack the rook. And now, again, big strategic decision from White. Should you prevent black's king going for this h-pawn, or do you block it out with a move like h3? Well, I think h3 should be a mistake, because in this case black exchanges and now can get counterplay using that pawn. Still not so clear, but you know, I can understand why Aronian decided not to go for that. Alternatively, you could try and block out the king with f3, but here again a bit of calculation I think will have convinced Aronian that this was the wrong way to go. You can see that this pawn is now under fire, or instead of that, if f4, then the black king can come round to try to attack this pawn here. So Aronian decided, okay, just push the pawn. Best decision. Now Karjakin goes in with his king. It's a bit scary, but Karjakin had calculated precisely here. First of all, he took off these pawns, and here he spent just a minute and a half over his next move, which was f4. At first I thought f3 would be a winning move. Well, it might be, but it's trickier than it looks. You see, you're boxing in the king, and I thought this would now be very easy. So, white can advance the king and the pawn up the board, shouldn't be any problem. But it's actually trickier than it looks. There's a beautiful possible defence for black. First of all, advance this pawn. Now you'll notice that black is running very short of moves. In fact, I think there is a win for white here, but it's tricky. Let me show you the basic defence for black. Now, this is a mistake for white, but it looks like it could be winning. We just want to try and scoop up some pawns. But now, brilliant move. Rook d2. Stalemate is such a common defence, actually. Obviously, if that's taken, no moves, stalemate. And if rook b5, then rook b2, also same stalemate defence. And if the rook moves away, well, then we can just take the pawn and that'll be a draw. I think after f3, probably white is still winning, but it's rather problematic. But very quickly, Aronian played f4, which is certainly a correct move, but involves very tricky calculation. Let's see. Now the drawback of f4 is that the king can come back to take this pawn. So, okay, black advances, he's going to take this pawn. And now, big moment for Aronian. How does he play this? Does he bring his king forward, support the pawn, but allow black in here and then advancing the pawn? No, he finds an excellent move. Rook b3. That gains time because it just cuts out black's king for the moment, so the king can't cross the line of that rook. Now, big decision for black. What do you play here? Karjakin advanced this pawn here. Let's see what happens if he just nudges to the side. King goes to support the pawn, and now h3 check. Very good move. Now Aronian would have had to calculate this. Let's see what happens. It turns into a race. The pawn advances, and now black obviously wants to support his f-pawn down the board. At first glance, it looks as though this is just way too slow. It looks as though black's counterplay is just coming and white's king is just too far away. But have a look at what happens. It's quite extraordinary. Fantastic calculation from Aronian. He would have had to have looked at this, examined this. So the rook stops the pawn. The king rushes back. And white's king gets there just in time. If king takes pawn, then king f3, and that's the end. The king is trapped at the side of the board, and well, let's see a nice variation here actually. If h3, then it's mate in 2. And in this position, if black makes a queen, then there's a key move. King f3. Shutting out black's king just for the moment, so the king can't approach the pawn and it can't get back, so white has time to take this and then the pawn goes home. That's a very important variation, a long variation but pretty forcing, but fantastic calculation from Aronian to see that. So in this position, Karjakin tried h3. But this is losing. King comes across, the rook goes back, and now this is a good move. Obviously if the king goes this way, then rook takes pawn. So the king has to move to the side, but now you can see it's trapped on the g file. And now the rook comes up the board. And in this position, Karjakin resigned. You can see his king is completely trapped, cut off by the rook. Let's see what happens if he'd advanced this pawn. The king comes forward, pawn advances again, and now, bang, rook f7, and the pawn is lost. So black can take this pawn and then white takes that, and that's game over. Brilliant technique from Aronian. So after 9 rounds, Aronian is leading with 7 points, and he's now 1.5 points clear of the rest of the field. Karjakin still on 5.5. Caruana and Dominguez could only draw today, so they're on 5.5, point and a half behind. As is Giri, he's also on 5.5. And then Hari Krishna and So on 5 points.